Okay, so we've looked at the Telegraph platform. Okay, we could have talked about a few extra things. Just remembering at a graphological level, we've looked at that in the past. The professionalism of the page, the color scheme of the page, whether it seems to be targeting a particular demographic. Also, then we've got this headline. Now, again, if we're thinking about ourselves as writers, okay, this is a very different type of headline than some of the ones we've seen, but it's equally credible. Okay, now we know this because it's part of the Telegraph platform, and there's some other ideas that are going to emerge as we look at the rest of this article that's going to confirm that this is a credible model. We could write like this writer in our exam as journalists in the exam and be successful. Okay, so let's see what happens next. So we've got our platform, the Telegraph. We've got our headline. So what would we expect to come next in that traditional kind of structure of an article? Yes, you're right. So we're going to be looking now at the stand first. Okay, so we go from a headline to a stand first. Now, for ourselves as writers, remembering this for the future is really important. That a really nice structural device in the exam to let it be really clearly known to our marker, to the examiner, that we know how journalists work, is to follow that headline, stand first, byline trio. Okay, if we use those three things, we immediately establish that we know that we're working as journalists. Okay, so here is our stand first. Just that we're going to read it together first, and then we're going to look at some of the tasks around it. Okay, university lecturer Dr. Katie Edwards has faced prejudice for her regional Mexborough accent, so much so that she's conducted research into it. Here, she explains why the problem is so much worse in academic circles. Okay, so we've got that lovely anchorage. In other words, that lovely sense of cohesion and link between our headline and our stand first. Now, what is interesting is our headline was very much first person. I'm fed up. Now it does switch to a third person kind of stand first, in which we're really being introduced to our writer, okay, to Dr. Katie Edwards. So some of the tasks I'm going to ask you to look at really are about establishing an understanding of who she is, okay, and why you can trust her. So in the opening stand first, can you please pick out the noun phrase used to establish the writer as having a credible opinion and perspective? Can you identify the noun that links to the idea of bias and being mistreated because of her accent? And which verb in the headline is being linked to this form of bias? Now, this is new. We didn't do this last week, but I talked about upping our reading skills. Now, this is about tracking ideas. So in the headline, so you might need to look, flick back in a minute, which verb in the headline is being used and linked to this form of bias in this stand first? In other words, what's the connection? How is the headline being connected to this stand first on the idea of bias? Okay, so don't panic in a minute. You're going to pause and work through these tasks at your own pace. Okay, so remember, the green code is always about language labeling activities. The blue is about just checking in with the what. Okay, what are we reading? What does it connect to and what we've learned before? So it says here the idea of researching accent and attitudes towards, the idea of researching accent and attitudes towards those accents, not new. Can you name 3 other theorists conducting research into this area? So Dr. Katie Edwards is also a researcher. Can you think of 3 other theorists that we've looked at that do a similar process, conducting research? And the grey, remember, this is something that we can borrow. The grey directs us to something this writer is doing that we can borrow and use in our own writing or in other areas, other tasks. And it says here, byline. What's the name of the writer? And it also reminds us that this is what we call an opinion piece of journalism. But I will explain that when you're able to tell me in a minute the name of the writer. So just pause there. Okay, work through those tasks at your own pace and be ready to share and check your ideas and mark your ideas in about when you're ready. Okay, lovely people. So actually, I'm going to just start with the byline because it comes in really quickly, actually, in that very first noun phrase. So what's the name of our writer? Dr. Katie Edwards, right. So give yourself a tick. Now, why this then becomes an opinion piece of journalism? Okay, and if we look at the bigger context of that stand first, Dr. Katie Edwards is not a journalist. Okay, that's not her job, that's not her profession. But she is writing an opinion piece of journalism to be published in the Telegraph. Okay, so sometimes what we find is that credible publications, The Guardian, The Telegraph, will use the opinions or introduce opinion led journalism where somebody from a particular field is offering their opinion on a given topic. Okay, and Dr. Katie Edwards could help us then go to the other task of noun phrases used to establish the writer as having a credible opinion. We've got ourselves a doctor, somebody that has achieved an incredibly high level of academic achievement. Okay, she's got her doctorate. We also now know that she's a university lecturer. So those noun phrases are immediately creating or representing her as being credible. She's a university lecturer, she's employed, she's professional at a very high level. She's a doctor, she's achieved her doctorate, so she's intelligent, she's academic. She has achieved those accolades by her own work, merit, and intelligence. So now we could potentially trust her opinion, her perspective. Now, what's the noun phrase here that links the idea of bias and being mistreated because of her accent? Yes, prejudice. She has faced prejudice. Now, prejudice is this idea of a negative bias where people are discriminated against and mistreated because of an aspect of um, their demographic, because of something about them. Now, we're used to seeing prejudice aligned with maybe racism or sexism, forms of discrimination based on gender or ethnicity, sometimes sexuality, so we're aware of homophobia, so we're aware that we are a society that is capable of prejudice. In this article, the lens is shifted, though, away from those more traditional areas that we might associate prejudice with, towards what area? Yep, accent. So somebody who is being mistreated, who's being negatively treated, that there is a bias against them because of the way they speak. Now, what was the verb in the headline that links to bias and how she was being treated? Bit trickier, but it's creating those cohesive links. So it's tracking ideas. She was, yes, ridiculed. So that verb ridiculed in the headline is now being grouped, creating a lexical set here with the idea of prejudice. Okay, and we could put into that group as well problem, that problem, prejudice, and ridicule all go together to help us already understand that this is an article that's highlighting, putting a spotlight on the problem, the issue when people are being prejudiced and ridiculing others because of the way they speak. So we're starting to link those ideas together. It's starting to strengthen our understanding of what's happening. Okay, so this idea of researching people's treatment and behaviour towards people based on the way they speak is not new. Can you give me 3 of our theorists? Okay, brilliant. Yeah, we've got Laboff, we've got Jars, we've got Bernstein, we've got Milroy, we've got Aitchison, okay? They're our theorists. So any 3 of those will give you marks. Okay, so we're now just going to end today's lesson by just zooming in on the first paragraph of this article, okay? And just doing some work around it. So, good old Dr. Katie Edwards. I do like this woman and I love this article. So what happened? So we're just going to read the paragraph together and then do these activities. Okay, my lovelies? So, last month, I attended an international academic conference. During a conversation with a colleague, I was introduced to a doctoral student from a UK Russell Group university. Without a hello, a nice to meet you, or any of the other pleasantries you'd expect to hear during a professional introduction, this woman looked in my eyes and said, straight-faced, in a booming, fake Yorkshire accent, "Intai." Okay, so we're going to look at the activities around this. You're going to respond, and then that's today's learning. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go today. Okay, so I've said over here in our grey, remember pegs. So when we've looked at the journalistic task and how to structure a journalistic response, we know we want to use a headline, a stand first, a byline, but we've also looked at pegs. So pegs are the device by which writers work to create a link between the idea, the issue, the topic they're writing about, and a real world context. In other words, they want to make the issue, the ideas relevant, significant, or worthy of reading about. And they do that by pegging the issue into something a reader might already be interested in or aware of. It literally works like a peg. I've just been pegging out my washing this morning. It creates that link point between two objects, okay, two ideas. So pegs can be quite varied, and sometimes writers can use a combination of these pegs, okay? So a peg can be a link to a real world event or story, so something that's actually happening in the world around you at this given time. So if we were writing an article, we might look at creating a link to a real world event such as this pandemic, such as COVID-19. That is a real world event and story. We've just celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. We could see in the future if we could create a link between that real world event and what we're writing about. So that's what we mean by number one, a link to a real world event. Number two, anecdotal. Now, anecdotal means that they create a peg to their own experience. They're going to tell us a story from their own experience that makes the issue relevant to them. So they're hoping there to create a connection between a reader and a writer that's anecdotal, that's relational. Because we like the writer, we're going to be interested in their story. Okay, so anecdotal is anything that draws upon a story that is particular to the writer. So they've experienced it for themselves. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you can have creative pegs. So that's the use of extended metaphors or a creative image or symbol that creates a link into the story. And fourth, you can have a cultural peg where you could link to popular or high culture. Now, popular culture is where you might link to film, media, music, things that are part of popular culture. High culture, we might see in certain types of publication where they might link to something literary. So a good old reference to Shakespeare, to Dickens, to the theatre, something that's associated with high culture. But all four of those are devices that a journalist, a writer might choose to use in order to create a connection. So in a minute, you're going to pause and you're going to tell me, and have a look at this paragraph again, what peg has this writer used? So which of these four is this writer using and how do you know? Okay, now to help you, the green and the blue over here are going to help you maybe answer that question in a bit more detail. So can you identify the pronouns being used in this opening? Which adverbial phrase establishes a time phrase? Which noun phrase establishes place? And what's the significance of this setting? And if you had to paraphrase and put into your own words, what's happened to Katie Edwards? What's her experience? What's happened to her at this event? So just pause there, and then we're going to go through the answers together, and that'll be us for today. Okay, lovely people. So what peg is this writer use, and how do you know? So out of 1 to 4, what is this writer doing? Yes, they're being anecdotal. They are telling us a story. Dr. Katie Edwards is telling us her story about what happened to her. Okay? Now, there is an overlap sometimes to a real world event because this really did happen to her, but it's her experience. So it's primarily anecdotal. Last month, I attended an international academic conference. So actually, if we look through this paragraph, we've got the primary or the predominant use of the personal pronoun I. So anecdotal and the pronoun I go hand in hand. Okay, we use the pronoun I when we're telling our own stories. I was hanging out the washing today. I'm sat here at home during COVID-19. Okay, I'm telling you stories. Brilliant. So if you've got the pronouns I, you're right. Now they do use, she does use you. Okay, nice to meet you. You'd expect. So there are other pronouns being used, and that's that anecdotal relationship that she's trying to create. I'm telling you my story, and I want you to listen. Brilliant. Okay. Now, what adverbial phrase establishes a time frame? So stories are often located in time. So when was this story happening? Brilliant. Last month. So actually, she leads with that adverbial phrase. Last month, I attended. So she's leading with when it happened and what she was doing. So now these noun phrases, there's quite a few. Okay, so hopefully you'd have got a selection. So an international academic conference, UK Russell Group University, professional. Sorry, that's for in a minute. So we've got those noun phrases. Now, what's the significance of this setting? Dr. Katie Edwards is attending an international academic conference. Okay, now she's not gate crashing. She's not serving goods. She's not there as a waitress. She's there in a professional context as a doctor of expertise. So Dr. Katie's is at a prestigious, privileged event as a worthy academic. But what happens to her there? Brilliant. A student, a doctoral student, is introduced to her and immediately ridicules and mocks her accent. So that's taking us back to that headline, shut your face, I'm ridiculed. It takes us to the stand first, the idea of prejudice that's still given to people of a particular accent. So I hope you got those answers today, and I'll see you tomorrow.